welcome to episode 56 of the CRICKETher weekly Vodcast. Taking us back to last week, we talked about the relaunch this year of Women's County Cricket Day, and Raf had a chat to Women's County Cricket Day founder Richard Clark. This week there have been some developments which aren't massively encouraging, unfortunately, though, Raf. What's the latest with COVID regulations and all that bump?
Yes, well, we are a bit confused at the moment, to be honest, and we're not 100% sure whether we're going to be able to push ahead with the plan for WCCD on Monday the 3rd of May. The government guidelines that have been issued seem to be in conflict with each other.
Our government! In confusion and cock-up. Viewers in other countries will be shocked. Viewers in England will be shocked as well.
Absolutely. So basically they've issued guidance now that seems to suggest that cricket clubs can provide outdoor hospitality to people, whilst also saying that spectators at cricket matches are not permitted. So it seems like you can go to your cricket club and engage in outdoor refreshment, but you cannot watch cricket while doing so.
So you have to turn your back to the game while you're having a beer.
It's all a bit strange because why else would people go to a cricket club to partake of refreshment if not to watch cricket? So, and the ECB did have some guidelines on their website that I think have now been taken down because of this confusion about what exactly the government will and won't permit. And the dilemma that we're facing, and obviously that Richard is facing as kind of the head honcho of WCCD, is that should we be encouraging spectators at matches when we're not quite sure whether the government allow it or not. So essentially, we will keep bringing you updates as soon as we have them, and follow at Women's Cricket Day on Twitter if you aren't already, because that's got all of the latest news as soon as we get any kind of confirmation. So it's not looking as positive as it was last week, unfortunately, but we're not totally saying it definitely won't go ahead.
Okay, right. Well, now, excuse me.
What are you doing?
Well, Raf, it's the latest ICC playing conditions. They've abolished ties.
Not that kind of tie.
Oh.
No, they... What it means, Sid, is, you know, if the scores are level at the end of an ODI, and that's a tie, yeah, so they've got rid of... They're saying that if it's a tied match, instead of the result just being a tie, as it has been in the past, and there have been 6 tied ODIs in the history of women's ODI cricket, and actually, really interestingly, 2 of them took place in the 1982 Women's World Cup in New Zealand, and they both featured England. So England had tied games in that World Cup against both Australia and New Zealand. But the tie will be no more because it will now be decided by a super over. Now we were just having a bit of a look for the government. We were just having a bit of a look for the
government guidelines on the mind graph.
The government guidelines, yeah, the ICC tournament regulations for the 2017 World Cup, and we believe that under those guidelines, under those regulations, there would not have been a super over if any of the games had been tied. So, for example, in England's semi-final against South Africa, which did come right down to the wire, our understanding is that it wouldn't have been. There would not have been any super over.
Yeah, that would have been decided by a count back of the number of stitches knitted by the captain's grandmothers in their knitting that they'd been doing since the start of play or since the start of the tournament. I'm not sure.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so now there's going to be super overs. What do you reckon, Sid?
Oh, super overs are always fun, aren't they? I mean, the super overs don't fix all problems, as I hate to remind viewers of the outcome of the Men's World Cup in 2019, was it? I lose track of time with this whole COVID thing. So super overs don't fix all your problems necessarily, but a super over can be fun and exciting. I sort of feel personally a little bit of a twinge of, like a tie is a thing in cricket, and I don't really see in some ways why it shouldn't continue to be a thing. Next thing we know, the ICC will be saying that we can't have any drawn tests anymore. Tests have to be decided by a super over.
Why not?
Well, because that would be stupid. What would Americans have to take the mickey out of cricket if it wasn't for the fact that you can play a game for 5 days and it can be a draw?
That's true.
Yeah.
You can, and you also, of course, can have a tied test.
Of course, yes.
So yeah.
Anyway,
the ICC have also abolished the second power play in women's ODIs as well. What do you reckon of that?
it's a job half done. Personally, I think I should just abolish the power play. They keep going about trying to make cricket more accessible and more simpler. And I think the power play is massively guilty of being like confusing, and nobody's really quite sure what's going on for half of it, and people forget it. And we've literally seen people like forget about it in county games and things. And it's like, just play the same fielding restrictions for the entire game. Don't have a confusing thing where one over you can do one thing but the next over you can't and you have to do something different, and just have the fielding restrictions in place for the entire game. If they're good for the power play, they're good for the whole game. I'd just abolish the idea of power play completely.
I've got an idea. You could have it just being played over 100 balls.
Yeah, that would improve things immeasurably, Raf.
Moving on. The New Zealand v Australia series, or tour actually, has now concluded. So they played 3 T20s. Well, they actually played 2 T20s in the end. The last one was rained off, and it was a 1-1 series result in the end. So they did that awkward thing at the trophy presentation where one captain holds one arm of the trophy and the other holds the other. And then in the ODIs, Australia clean swept the 3-match series. So it was a pretty dominant result overall for Australia, wasn't it, Sid?
Yeah, I mean, for all that, I guess the records will show that the T20 series was drawn, or was it tied?
No.
Perhaps they should have had a super over.
They couldn't because it was raining.
The records will show that series was drawn, but Australia continued their dominant streak in ODIs, and it just felt like there was a certain inevitability towards them crushing New Zealand in every game again. And I still have these concerns for the future of ODI cricket if Australia are going to continue being quite this dominant. I mean, their winning streak, which we will come to in a minute, is one thing, but it's more the fact that of like the last 50 games that Meg Lanning has captained, she's lost like 7 of them. Australia are just not losing games, and it's getting boring. The crowds weren't huge. I think that we may have a problem coming down the line, but nevertheless, if you're Australia, you're obviously going to carry on winning games, and the Australian fans will be delighted. And why not? You've got an extremely dominant team, and it's come from a place where Australia do have significantly more resources than the other teams, so you'd expect them to win these games, but you still have to go out and win them. And these players are still the best players in the world, and you can't but admire the way that Ashley Gardner has been batting. She bowled really well in the last game as well, throughout their team, they've got so many fantastic players that even when they lose a few wickets, as they did in the final ODI, which was cut down to 25 overs, and it did look like they were perhaps in trouble at one point, but in the end they weren't, because they're just so strong all the way down. So good for them.
Okay. Now, you did briefly mention there that in the news this week has been their winning streak. I think it's now up to 24 ODIs, dating back to 2017, that they're unbeaten in the format. So they've broken the previously held record, which was by Ricky Ponting's side way back at the start of the century. So yeah, it's an interesting one, and it's definitely been something that seems to have been talked about a lot and seems to have been on the cards for a long time, partly because it's been quite slow to actually come to fruition because of the delay in matches due to COVID. But anyway, they've got this winning streak going now. and it's interesting, a lot of the talk around ahead of the third ODI actually did kind of relate to this winning streak. And I have to say, I think that there's beginning to be a bit of an unhealthy obsession with it in some areas of the media and perhaps some areas of kind of supporters. It's great that they've done it, and as you say, we have to recognise it's a big achievement. On the other hand, there definitely was talk on Twitter from people saying, they shouldn't get out there and try and play the third ODI because it looks like rain, the weather forecast is bad, and if they do a toss and they go out there and start the game and then it has to be abandoned because they haven't played enough overs, then that would break the winning streak. And therefore they shouldn't even be trying to play because that would be a really bad way to end the winning streak. And I just think that that's such an unhealthy attitude to have, to actually go, if it looks like rain or if there's anything that might affect play today, then we don't want to play cricket just because Australia then potentially risk losing. That's such a negative attitude.
Yeah, I mean, certain members of the commentariat had kind of dug themselves into a hole, hadn't they? Because they had decreed by their mighty hands that somehow if the game didn't get played or didn't get completed because it never started, that wouldn't break the winning streak. But a no result when the game started would break the winning streak, which, you can argue. I mean, clearly, obviously, if Australia lost, that would break the winning streak. But, it strikes me that there are arguments both ways, but it's almost like the commentariat decreed initially they wanted to have it both ways, and then when having it both ways looked like it was going to break the streak, then they suddenly decided that to go for a completely outlandish response, which was, we shouldn't play the game at all then. I mean, if you're not going to play a game of cricket because there's a risk it might rain,
it's just not a place that we want to be in. And there also begins to be a level of kind of almost being a bit too partisan. Now we don't make any, we don't make any bones about the fact that we are kind of supporters of England. On the other hand, I would never not want there to be cricket played because England risk losing a game. I also think that it's a bit naive because it relates to your earlier point about the fact that Australia winning all the time does get boring and eventually potentially will turn people off from the game as much as it will turn people on. And really, actually, that's quite worrying if Australia are so dominant. And the kind of the commentariat, as you describe them, should be perhaps recognising that. In a long time, I haven't been as excited as I was when New Zealand won that second T20. I was literally jumping up and down in our living room, wasn't I? And it was like 6 a.m. here, and Sid had a go at me and said, "You're gonna
neighbours."
Yeah, you're gonna wake the neighbours up.
Not the Australian soap opera.
Yeah, I thought that's where you were going with that for a minute. Anyway, so I was really excited, and the reason was because it just felt so much like it was kind of turning against the expected result, and obviously it was a really close game, and that's the kind of cricket that we want to be seeing ultimately, competitive, tight cricket, rather than cricket where one side is way dominant over the other. I don't think that's healthy for the sport, and I don't think that anyone, whether we be commentator, journalist, or just kind of a fan, should be sort of thinking that that's a good and positive and healthy state of affairs. So, I think that to congratulate Australia on their winning streak is the right thing. But to obsess over it now and go, they can't play this, they can't risk losing this, is taking it too far. So let's stop with that now.
Okay.
Were there any areas of weakness for Australia, Sid? Because you've talked about them being quite dominant in most of those games.
Yeah, there aren't really, are there? But there was one thing that I noticed, which was, a big part of Australia's success over the last few years has been actually the team behind the scenes. It's been their analysts and their coaching team. They're the unsung heroes, if you like. And to be fair, people like Meg Lanning and Elise Perry have totally acknowledged them. They've always said thanks to the behind the scenes guys, and they are a really important part of giving Meg Lanning all the armoury she needs to be able to go out there and captain brilliantly. I remember commenting before that whenever you come up against an Australian side, all the fielders are always in the right place, and that's because the analysts have done their homework and Australia have taken that on board and executed that in the field. But that can run up against the wall sometimes, and we saw that, I think, in this series against Lee Kasperek. Now, what really looks like's happened here is that the analysts said at the start of the series, oh, Lee Kasperek's the weak link, you can target her. So Australia targeted her, and they lost wicket after wicket after, and she wound up being the leading wicket taker in the series because they just could not get out of the, oh, the analysts have told us to target her, we'll just carry on doing it. And, she took 6 wickets in one game and another 3 or 4 in another. It's just like that sort of slightly robotic nature of the way that the Australians approached it perhaps is a little bit of a weak link. That if you can throw them off their stride, throw them off their game, that's how you can kind of get under their skin and start being able to put yourself in a position where you're more in control of the game.
I think if you think back to the 2017 World Cup semi-final against India, that's kind of what happened. They didn't have a backup plan for Harmanpreet Kaur. When they couldn't get her out, they didn't quite know what to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's interesting. I'm sure that we're going to get some comeback from Australian viewers. But that's fine. It's good to encourage debate, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. And the other area of concern or kind of issue for New Zealand is potentially the absence of Sophie Devine from most of these matches. She ended up going home, and they've said that essentially it's because of fatigue. And obviously she's one of their strongest players, but against England looked to be kind of really struggling for form actually. So what's going on there, Sid? Is that a bit of a worry?
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to speculate about Sophie, but in particular, we don't really have any more information that's out there in the public realm. And we'd obviously hope that she's back and playing as soon as possible. So this is not really about Sophie at all. But I think that partly this is a consequence of the fact that New Zealand haven't had a full professional setup. What's that got to do with it? Well, because New Zealand haven't had a full professional setup for a long time, the only way people like Sophie and other players like Susie Bates and the Satterthwaite and co. That the only way they've been able to make a living out of cricket is to go all over the world and play in all these other competitions. And it means that someone like Sophie is essentially living in a hotel or living in a rented apartment for 11 months a year. She's here and there and other way, literally crossing the globe. She spends part of the Antipodean season just literally going jet, playing the New Zealand domestic competitions, come back for us Australian domestic competitions, go back to New Zealand. And it's ultimately that's a very taxing way of living. Yeah. And they haven't had the super luxuries. These people, the women aren't flying first class. They're having to fly. I mean, they're flying business these days, but for a long time, people like Sophie were flying economy. And we've really driven these players into the ground. And Sophie's been away from friends outside the game who are so important to keeping people grounded. She's been away from her family. She's been away from her partner for huge chunks of the year. And it's just not healthy. And we need to take better care of our international cricketers in future. And someone like England are doing that now. You see, so if a Tammy Beaumont, if she says one winter, I'm not going to do the WBBL because I'm going to. I want to spend Christmas with my partner or my family, or I just want to kick back a bit and recharge my batteries. She can do that because she's got a reasonably well paid professional contract. She's not earning £500,000 a year, but she's earning enough that she can go, I don't need the WBBL. Whereas these New Zealand players, unfortunately, are not making enough money.
They have to supplement their income, don't they? Yeah.
So they feel forced to do it because they're like, well, God, I've got a mortgage to pay. If I don't do WBBL, I'm $7,000 down, and that's a big chunk of their income, and that's just not a healthy way to proceed. So I think I just beg the authorities to take notice of this and to make sure that that going forward we take better care of the next generation.
I think that's a really important point, Sid. Very impassioned plea there, and I would add actually that I think that some of the press coverage around this and media coverage around this needs to be a bit more nuanced as well, because Sophie Devine is criticised for a loss of form in the same way that, I don't know, Elise Perry or Meg Lanning would be criticised for a loss of form. But she is experiencing potentially levels of fatigue that somebody in the Australian setup wouldn't necessarily be familiar with, or in the England setup indeed, because as you say, they can take a break if they need to by virtue of being better paid. And I think that some of the coverage around that and some of the criticism, we absolutely encourage criticism, but some of the criticism maybe doesn't necessarily kind of take into account that nuance. Anyway, I think that's pretty much all for this week. Thanks for tuning in, as ever, and hopefully next week we might be a bit clearer on whether or not Women's County Cricket Day is or is not going ahead. Until then, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.